I'm going to start semi-formally here, Will, because I have the great pleasure to be sitting down with the amazing Will Keepin. Will has got so many different accolades and achievements in life. We'll be touching on some of them through this conversation, but let me just start by saying, Will, it's an honor to be sitting down with you.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here and also an honor. Thank you.
I got to see Will do an incredible presentation at the Hollow Movement in, I think it was April 2024, really unpacking the insights of David Bohm. Will is a mathematical physicist, apart from many other things, mathematician and a physicist, apart from many other things. But we're sitting down today in the context of this book from 2016 that Will has published called Belonging to God, Spirituality, Science, and Universal Path of Divine Love. And I was really particularly interested, Will, in unpacking with you some of the themes that came out of the discussion around the Hollow Movement, the relationship between science and spirituality. And in the context of a new anthology that's going to be coming out, acknowledging the origin of Wayne Teasdale's work and into spirituality, and Kurt Johnson's seminal book, The Dawn of the Interspiritual Age, or The Coming into Spiritual Age. There's a new anthology coming out, and I was particularly interested in exploring that dynamic relationship between science and spirituality, because we see a lot of confirmations, particularly let's talk about not just mainstream scientific status quo, but more on the evolutionary edge of science and the sort of work you do in quantum theory, quantum physics. And we see now a lot of work has gone into harmonizing, synergizing science and spirituality, which of course have had tremendous conflicts, religion and science, through the centuries. So this work of harmonizing them is very, very important. And, it's important to see that scientific approach and the spiritual approach may be different ways of understanding the one ultimate interconnected reality. And that's a beautiful idea. But what has kind of the thinking that sort of stimulated this conversation, Will, was that there are some things in the mystical tradition, through the religious heritages of humanity, both Eastern, Western, ancient, indigenous, there are some understandings of spiritual truth which I wonder if science can never really fully come to see and acknowledge, because they are ultimately different domains or different magistries. I know you've got some beautiful quotes to share about this thinking, but the point where science and spirituality are harmonious, but also the real area to explore is, what about those areas where there's not a full overlap? What about those areas where it's actually the spiritual, mystical traditions have something to offer about the nature of God, about the relationship of humanity to ultimate reality, that perhaps science is not, and this is no criticism of science, but it's just not set up to offer insights into. And so that was the basis of our discussion when you suggested I dive into this book, which does an incredible job of really looking at similarities in Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity, then goes into talk about these issues of science and spirituality, and then comes to a point in the appendix of then laying out that science and mysticism are not the same, which might be different to what people are hearing about how science and spirituality are so supportive of each other. So big topic, big subject. You've done an amazing job putting it all into this extraordinary book, which I highly commend to everybody. I've been buying gifts for people and sending them around, and will continue to do that, of this book. It's that amazing. But Will, tell us a little bit, as a scientist and as somebody who has been on a deep spiritual exploration for much, if not most, of your life. Tell us what you see as the places where science and spirituality do converge, and potentially the spaces where they don't.
Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you for that beautiful intro and reflective question. Where to start? Uh, Let me start with, first of all, acknowledging that there is a major awakening taking place in science right now. And this is really beautiful. It's We're seeing in quantum physics and relativity theory a kind of expansion of the awareness of the vastness of the cosmos and of the fundamental interconnectedness of everything with everything else. And this is something that science has come to from within purely scientific terms. And a recent, very profound development was in 2022 when the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to three physicists who basically proved the reality of what is called quantum entanglement, which I think is a bit of a misnomer because it's not a tangle. I like to think of it as quantum communion, or perhaps better term would be Thich Nhat Hanh's term of interbeing, that every aspect of creation has an interbeingness with every other aspect of creation. And this has now been essentially proven scientifically. And I want to bring that forward because that's part of the beauty at which scientific discoveries are literally validating, if you will, spiritual truths that have been proclaimed by mystics across the millennia. And at a level that even, bless his heart, Albert Einstein was objecting to. You know, Albert Einstein called the inherent interconnectedness of everything with everything else that quantum physics was showing us, he called it spooky action at a distance, and he repudiated it. But spooky action at a distance, his dreaded spooky action at a distance has now been essentially proven in a whole series of experiments over 50 years that consistently validate this. So I want to start there because I want to acknowledge that science is actually able sometimes to demonstrate some of the realities that these mystics from the spiritual and religious traditions of the world have been proclaiming for millennia. So let's start there on the positive ground. On the challenging side, and the reason I wrote that appendix, that science and mysticism are not the same, is because there has been a kind of facile equivalence of the two, partly because of the enthusiasm generated by some of these remarkable parallels. But there's also been, both among scientists and I think among certain religious seekers, a naive equating of the two as if being a quantum physicist is tantamount to having a deep spiritual practice. Now, it's possible to do it. There are physicists I know, and I consider myself one of them, who do have a serious commitment and long-term spiritual practice, but it is very rare. And the reason it's rare is because to practice spirituality, you have to go beyond the mind. You have to go into the depths of the fullness of human experience, but also into the depths of the silence of the heart, which transcends the mental states and the whole mental world. And this is known and been proclaimed by mystics down through the centuries. Blaise Pascal said it so beautifully when he said, "The heart has reasons, of which reason has no knowledge." So there is a domain of the heart. There's what I call an epistemology of the heart. The heart has its own ways of knowing, its own science, if you will. And it is a whole way of discovering the nature of reality that happens through the inner contemplative, inner consciousness journey. And this is something that the science that is rooted in mental inquiry is basically still pretty much clueless about. Now, that is changing. We are seeing a number of scientists that are beginning to practice a spiritual practice very seriously in the West. In the East, they've been there for forever. I've met many scientists in India over the years who are deep spiritual practitioners who recognize the blind spots of the scientific worldview. They have no problem with it. They do their science by day, often very impeccably, and then in the evenings and on the weekends, they practice their spirituality, and there's no contradiction for them at all. But in the West, we have this idea that science somehow contradicts religion. There has been a long-standing conflict between the two. So that's a way of opening. Let me say a couple other things in response to this. The two greatest obstacles, in my view, that prevent science from advancing are its commitment to a materialist cosmos, the idea that the material dimension of reality is the totality of reality, and its epistemology of the mind. Namely, its fundamental instrument for knowing is limited to the human mind. And the human mind is, great as it is, a limited faculty, and we have other faculties. And if we don't cultivate those other faculties of knowing, we have a very limited worldview. And the mind, as we see both in science and religion, there's a common weakness that they share. And I'm going to read one of these lines from the Mundaka Upanishad, because this really captures the essence both of fundamentalism in religion and equivalent fundamentalism in science. And it goes like this: ignorant of their own ignorance, yet wise in their own esteem, these deluded people, proud of their vain learning, go round and round like the blind led by the blind. And that right there is the hubris of the scientific view that believes they have the only corner of truth and everything else doesn't. It's the same hubris you find among certain fundamentalist religious people who believe their religion has the corner on the truth and no other religion or any other philosophy has anything valid. So this is part of the cherished weakness of the mind that has to be overcome. So that's one blind spot that we see. The last part I'll say is that then the Sufis have a beautiful saying, which is, understanding the inability to understand is true understanding. And what they mean by that is that the higher spiritual states of awareness and consciousness cannot be experienced or reduced to mental perception and conceptual categories. And so those experiences are another domain of consciousness to which every being has access, every human being has access, yet few ever access. As one of the great, I think it was Plotinus who said that. We have this capacity, which we all have, but few actually cultivate. And so spirituality cultivates this dimension of awareness, and I call it the epistemology of the heart. It does somewhat involve the mind, and it involves the whole body, but ultimately it's centered, in a sense, in the heart, which is the primary organ of spiritual perception. And science cannot discover that unless it expands itself. So I'll close this whole little piece by just saying that we live in a culture that is enamored with the love of science, yet we have failed to develop a science of love. We don't have yet a whole understanding of this other whole way of perceiving reality, existence, and the cosmos. And this has very negative consequences. Let me just say one of them. I have a PhD in mathematical physics. I never once, in my entire training, had a single course in ethics or moral law. There's an assumption in the practice and principles of science that morality and ethics are either ontologically irrelevant or independent of this great quest for scientific truth. When in fact, the reality is those are part of truth as well. There is a whole set of laws that are operative in those domains of morality and ethics. And science urgently needs to incorporate these, because science has been also the instrument through which tremendous damage and weapons and darkness have come. You know, people talk about that in terms of religion. And rightly so. How many people have been killed in the name of God by different religions? But we could also look at science. Nuclear physics gave us nuclear weapons, and chemistry gave us gunpowder and the gas chamber, and biology gave us germ warfare. And these things have killed millions. And this is not a critique of science, but it is a question of how can we turn science to the highest human purposes fully and really cultivate the highest dimensions of scientific inquiry to serve the highest evolution of humanity. For that, we need to open to essentially what I'd like to call the science of the heart, but we need the opening to the spiritual dimension of reality. And this is where we come to the first problem with science, is it tries to reduce everything to the material forces and factors, when in fact, the testimony from all the great philosophers and traditions across all of the spiritual traditions of the world is that there are layers and levels ontologically. And there's at least 3 to 5 to 49, depending on which system you look at. But they all acknowledge that the physical universe is not the totality of reality. And even science is now starting to show this. So this is a very exciting moment because science itself is beginning to show the limitations of its own methods. And I'll close. I keep saying I'm going to close, but my last little here is one of the great advances of contemporary recent science in the last 10 years is the discovery of dark matter and dark energy, which now they basically claim constitutes about 94% of the cosmos. So we now have materialist science, to its credit, acknowledging that it has a grip at most on 6% of what's going on. The rest, the other 94%, science doesn't have a clue. And it's now admitting that. And those are some of the domains in which some of these spooky action at a distance, these spiritual forces are operative.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm. Thank you, Will. Thank you. Just we could listen to you all day, just laying it all out there and seeing, yeah, some really exciting developments where, in a sense, you might be saying science is catching up to spiritual insights or mystical experience. Um, and yet I wonder if they're not, you know, necessarily fundamentally distinct modes of interpreting the world and have different purposes to that degree. So that we might say that science and spirituality are not the same, but they are complementary. And I think what I hear you saying is actually need each other in a degree as we go forward in this evolutionary march deeper into a greater expanded truth. We see religion when it's not conditioned by the best of science can fall into superstition and can fall into all sorts of wacky stuff. And similarly, science, when it is not given a moral, imbued with moral insight and ethical understanding that can come from a spiritual philosophy, even from religious grounding, can therefore create these incredible things, but then use them for destructive purposes. So in that sense, we see the complementary nature that they are distinct. There is connection, perhaps through the realms of philosophy, but they are ultimately science and spirituality are not overlapping, and they need each other. They need each other to condition each other and to go forward into greater truth together.
I completely agree. And I think that the way you put it is really beautiful. We need both, and they need one another. They actually need one another to accomplish the fullness of their own mission. And so I think that's a beautiful, succinct summary of the situation. And they need to stop fighting and start collaborating. And of course, they are in many ways, but there still has been this tension. It's an ancient, deep tension, particularly in the Western tradition. It goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. It goes back to the early pre Socratic Greeks. You see it, I mean, in the religion. I mean, even Margarita Porete, who was burned at the stake in 1310, I think. And her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, was a dialogue between love and reason. Beautiful book. that is said to have deeply inspired and influenced Meister Eckhart, one of the greatest Christian mystics. But she was basically saying there's something else. And reason at that point was theology. She was basically saying love and theology, we need them both. And love is something that's rooted in the heart. It's essentially what we're saying, because theology is really the mental inquiry into spirituality. And in a sense, we need both because we human beings have a heart and we have a mind.
Mm.
And science cultivating primarily the mind, and spirituality properly done is primarily cultivating the heart. We need to bring the two together and
Mm.
skillfully integrate the insights from both. And I think that we are slowly moving in that direction. I do.
Mm. Mm.
But a lot
Mm.
of it starts. Yeah. And I think
This is
what you were wanting to get at is that science cannot fully discover the totality of spiritual reality, that we need to recognize that. And I think that's really true. And in fact, as it is certain discoveries that science are making now, it's finally realizing things that the mystics have known for thousands of years. I'll give you one example. I believe that science will soon officially declare scientifically that human consciousness in some form survives physical death. The data on this is just becoming increasingly overwhelmingly compelling. Thousands of cases from all cultures across the world of near-death experience, of out-of-body experiences, of mediumship research, independent verifications of communications with the other side. It's really profound. The
Mm.
reincarnation research, all of these different domains are showing that it ain't like we thought, that, it's all she wrote when you keel over. That the basic teaching of, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, the first teaching in the beginning of chapter 2 is that the person does not die when the body dies. All other religions attest to this in different ways, that there's something that survives physical death and goes on, and the scientific evidence for that is mounting dramatically. Now, there is resistance to it from the kind of determined
Yes.
material scientists, but I think the evidence is gonna prevail. And as it does, it's gonna force essentially a type of scientific revolution on that point, and that will be a real breakthrough. And that's also a humbling moment for science to realize that religion, spirituality has known this for 3,000 years longer than we have.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe there's more to learn from these folks.
Yes, well, that's a very exciting prospect, Will, that science would make that declaration. You feel like there's going to be always significant resistance to something like that, and part of it would be how convincing, overwhelming is the evidence, and I think that's going to depend a little bit on one's perspective, and it'll be interesting to see that unfold. I want to leave science behind for a little
Okay.
and let's move fully into the mystical experience, which you've so brilliantly. I love how you have explored it through many of the world's traditions. And in this book, really focusing on your incredible depth of knowledge of Hinduism, in particular Bhagavad Gita, Christian scriptures, mystical tradition, and Islamic uh, scriptures and mystical tradition. It's really brilliant synthesis. But I want to talk about those. We grew up in the West. In the West, we have got an allergy to God. There is an allergy to God, which is totally understandable from all of the limitless sins of religion that we all know so well, and the portrayals of the imagery of God. It's interesting in Islam, it's forbidden to make images of the divine. Maybe that's a good idea, because some of these images of the divine had come back to haunt us, and the old white man in the sky or whatever. But in terms of, as people embrace, because spirituality never going away. I mean, we go back, what is it, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the height of the neo-atheistic kind of rise of all the publications that were happening. That's kind of had its moment. It's moved on. Spirituality is alive and flourishing. But then we see a lot of people that are resonating with this kind of science, spiritual, kind of monism in a way, it might be called, where it's just everything's kind of part of the same field. And that part of the spiritual traditions that you unpack in Hinduism, Christianity, and Judaism, Islam, they all centrally affirm a personal God. And this is something that is just not accessible through material science, and I doubt that it ever really will be. But it is central. And in that, the relationship between us as humans and the various concepts of the ultimate reality are absolute, but is a being with which we can have and are invited to have relationship. And that relationship can then grow into devotion. And it can even, at the very fulfillment or flowering of that spiritual path, grow into a kind of merging with the divine. And I note that you prefer, rather than the word oneness, you're going back to Meister Eckhart's inspiration. You bring the word isness when it comes to describing that merging. But whether or not it's worshiping God, being devoted to a divine ideal, having faith and devotion to God, this is a personal nature to the source, the absolute, the creator, however many layers of frameworks we want to put on it. But underneath it all, beyond all the words and beyond all the thinking and beyond all the frameworks, there is an invitation of being in relationship. And the quality of that relationship changes depending on the tradition. So for Islam, the highest relationship may be servant of Allah. In Christianity, it may be a child of God. In Hinduism, it may be identification or merging with the oversoul of Vishnu, or whatever it may be. But inside, in the very heart of each of those, is God as personal being. And that then invites faith, devotion, worship, all these things that really wouldn't make sense if it was just a field of energy. So I'd be interested to hear your insights in talking about this unique insight, which through the mystical tradition, through the scriptures, through the religious traditions, for all their warts and all the things that they've carried through the centuries, good and bad, that this heart of the teaching is this invitation into intimacy with God. I'd love to hear you talk about that. And is there any hope that science would ever be able to arrive at such an insight or understanding?
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you for that summary. And let me just say that, in this years of exploration across these traditions, there are certain foundational themes that emerge. And one of them is the declaration that the deepest truth of the human being is identity with the divine being. This is declared really across the scriptures. Now, it's not quite there in Islam. They don't quite put it that way. But because they have in Islam the notion that, God is greater than any creature. And so you can get intimately, infinitely close to God, but you never are God. But, Jesus says the same thing. Jesus says, I am one with the Father. Jesus proclaims the oneness with God. But then elsewhere, Jesus says, the Father is greater than I. So there's this acknowledgement, of course, that there's something. God cannot be reduced to one human being or one single creature. But one creature can become completely identified with God. It's what Panikar calls non-reciprocal identity, which is Jesus is fully God, but God is not merely Jesus. God is not only Jesus, God is all that is. And that experience that Jesus had in his identity with God is an experience that is found across the other traditions as well. This is really important. So it is the essence of the Upanishads, the four great utterances, the Mahavakyas, which are four articulations of the identity of the human Atman, the human soul, with the divine being. Atman is Brahman. The soul is the living God. Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman. That's the full mystical realization of the Hindu version of I and the Father are one. And you also have it in Islam with Al-Hallaj, for example, who proclaimed, I am the supreme reality, which is one of the names of God. He got similar treatment that Jesus got for proclaiming that. He was executed publicly, and they tore his body to pieces. And as they were doing so, he was praying for his executors, very similar to the way Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And what Al-Hallaj said as they were executing him was, if you had seen what I have seen, you would never be doing this. So he was able to forgive them, recognizing they were acting from ignorance. But he had experienced that supreme reality that is the revelation that comes to all the deepest mystics across all the traditions, as I see it. Now, the personality of God, the personhood, many of them talk about this incredibly intimate, direct connection with that supreme being. It's not just a sort of mergence into a vast oneness that has no boundaries anywhere and is infinite. It is an intimate infinite, and it's an infinite intimacy. And in that sense, it's a very deep personal relationship. And you see this in the way that Jesus spoke about Abba. Abba is a very term of endearment in Aramaic that means daddy, really. And you see it also in the way that Brother Lawrence talks about his awakening. Now, he's a Christian mystic of the 17th century, I think, who just was a monk in the kitchen. He was the cook and the cleaner in the kitchen. But he had a very deep realization, and he had this incredible direct connection to where the divine being was his personal support and friend in this deeply intimate way. You see this across the traditions. And you see it in the Bhagavad Gita, in the end of the Gita, where Krishna teaches Arjuna. Krishna is God. Arjuna is like you and me, the faltering but earnest disciple. And Krishna basically says, and he gives him the supreme secret and then doesn't give it to him. What he says is, this is secret, more secret than all that is secret. Take absolute refuge in me, absolute surrender in me, and we will become one. And all of your sins will be forgiven. But not only that, but what he doesn't say is that what will happen is that you and I, as the Supreme Divine, will live in this incredible, magical, mystical glory. Because there's a direct, supreme, infinite intimacy that then takes place and only happens at that highest level of realization. And that, to me, is the beauty of the theistic traditions. I think it happens in Buddhism also, because Buddha is worshipped, and Buddha is basically a being who realized the fullness of his Buddhahood as also the Dharmakaya, which is the source of all of existence, which he realized in his own being. And when someone becomes an fully enlightened Buddha, they're basically uniting with that same supreme principle. And as, for example, Reza Shah Kazemi, in his book Common Ground Between Islam and Buddhism, he basically documents in there all these direct parallels between the highest realization of God in this highly monotheistic tradition of Islam and the highest realization of the Buddhists in their realization of the uncompounded, non-created essence of the Buddha Dharma and the Dharmakaya in particular. And he basically says the reality that they're experiencing is identical. In one case, they call it theistic, and the other case, they call it non-theistic. But the personal connection of infinite intimacy that is so extreme and so totally exquisitely profound that one is in total awe and supreme bliss. And this is another thing that we find across the mystics. There is in that highest realization, they all speak of three qualities. One is they realize that they have been gifted with the highest truth there is. It's revealed to them and they realize this is God, direct experience of God. That conscious realization is totally overwhelming. And that's the consciousness of that supreme truth. And the fact of it puts them in a supreme, indescribable, transcendent bliss. It is the bliss of the realization of the Godhead. And across Hinduism and Sufism and Christianity, we see that. And I think it's there also in the non-theistic traditions. So I'll stop there for a moment. I don't know if that's...
No, that's magnificent. Will, it's magnificent. It's so beautiful. I think what you're laying out in this teachings, in this book, and in your message, is a universal, as it says here. It's a universal path of divine love. One can get there through any tradition. It's interesting. Just a little aside. I lived in Thailand for many years, and in of course, Theravada Buddhism is perhaps the most stringent non-theistic strain of Buddhism, as opposed to Mahayana and Vajrayana. But in Thailand, yes, the monks would tell me it's non-theistic. Buddha is not a god. But I would note the Thai people, when there was a health issue or when there was an exam that needed to be passed or whatever it was, the prayers would be as strident and as earnest and as devoted as any Muslim, Christian, or Jew or Hindu. And pray that almost innate urge to connect to a higher power, to ask for support and to reach out in a time of need is universal and transcends philosophical traditions. And so I love the way that you're portraying this great invitation to intimacy with the divine. And I suspect and feel quite sure that without your spiritual journeys, you wouldn't have arrived at that through mathematics and physics. As magnificent as they are, we would not arrive at this insight of the beingness of a creative being that is inviting us into intimate relations by whatever framework, through just the scientific process. So there is, I think, the raw example that through the spiritual invitation, not just into the energy field which correlates to the findings of new science, but beyond that into the deeper insights of the mystics of all traditions. And it's interesting, we go back, we look at the indigenous cosmologies too, Will. So many of them have creator as that fundamental principle. And of course, there's a variety, and there's 10,000 different, philosophical traditions across 100,000 varieties and more across the Earth's history. But that relationship to the spiritual higher power is near universal. And so maybe there is, in a way, as religion has to reinvent itself, the institutions of religions have gone through crisis after crisis. As spiritual seekers continue to look for what are the ways in which we can grow and develop spiritually? How can we expand our consciousness? How can I grow into being fully human? Whatever way people are framing that. But here is the secret of the sages and the invitation of the ages, which is into a personal exploration. And the resources that exist in Sufism, in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Judaism, in Sikhism, in Baha'i, and etc., and all of the above, and more, all of the traditions are so rich and vast. And so often they're accompanied by ecstatic poetry and, divine musical traditions which carry us forward as well. The resources are limitless. So that's the invitation really to every soul.
They are absolutely all of those expressions and those praise poems and those musical compositions are expressing this glory, it would not have come through just science, I don't think. And I'm not, criticizing science at all. I mean, it's incredibly profound, but there is a dimension here of getting to the ultimate essence of existence itself. And, all the traditions, they basically, like in Buddhism, you have what's called Buddha nature, right? Every human being has Buddha nature. And that is a recognition of this seed of profound awakening at the highest level, because that's what Buddha means, the awakened one. It is awakened to the deepest truth of reality. In Islam, they have what they call fitra, which is the fundamental essence of the human soul, but it's made from the essence of God. Fitra is the identical essence of God, and out of God's own fitra, God made the first human soul in the Islamic cosmology. So basically, God made the first human out of a droplet of himself, if you will. And then all other humans are made from that. So basically, you have similar in Judaism, we are made in the image of God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Well, we're not just made in the image. In a sense, we're made of the essence of God. That's really more the Islamic way of putting it. And in the Buddha sense, each one of us has this Buddha nature. So all these traditions are saying the deepest truth of who we are is this incredible, supreme divinity. And so when we can realize that directly in our own experience, it goes beyond mental conceptualization. It becomes a lived experience fully embodied in the entire body and very much expanding the heart into this infinite intimacy with all that is. That's the greatest experience there is, according to the mystics across the traditions. And the other thing I want to point out, which is so interesting, after they've had that experience, which transcends all the prayers and all the practices, at least according to the work of people who've studied what are they called, the traditionalists and the perennial philosophy, the highest mystics, they continue with their prayers, their practices, and their devotions. Devotion is rooted in a kind of duality, that there's a God and there's a me. And they've all experienced that there is no God in me. Those are illusions. That ultimately, I am one with that essence. My truest identity is none other than that identity. The deepest truth of who I am is none other than the deepest truth of who God is. So they know, kind of experientially, that there's no separation. And yet they still do this devotion because they're back in the relative world of being a creature. So the creature is this instantiation, this microscopic instantiation of the macroscopic infinity of God. It's so beautiful. The human creature is. And every creature is probably in its own way. But since we are humans, we can speak to the human experience. But that is really the glory of the human spiritual traditions. And as you say, it includes the indigenous traditions. That they all have this recognition, as Thomas Keating put it, that there's an other that's bigger and glorious and profound. And that recognition of that, you can't do anything but fall to your knees and honor it and worship it. And then you have the mystical experience of realizing the truth of who you are. You are none other than that other. So I am the other that I was first perceiving as something bigger and beyond me. And secondly, discovering I am that. And that's where the beautiful kind of fractal reality of mysticism comes in. Rumi puts it in his characteristically beautiful way when he says, you are not just a drop from the infinite ocean. You are the infinite ocean contained in a single drop. Or Ajit Mukherjee, the Buddhist, who said, if you come to know the deepest secrets of the body, you come to know the deepest secrets of the cosmos. There is a direct pathway to infinity directly through your own interior spiritual journey. And that's what happens mentally in science when you get a conceptual map of the entire universe. And it's beautiful when you study quantum physics and you get a whole mathematically orchestrated, beautiful, it's like the most magnificent piece of music. But it's still just, it's a conceptual map. In the spiritual realization, you get it
Mm,
in the depth of your heart as an experience. And it's just totally overwhelming and totally exquisite. Ruysbroek, who's one of the great Flemish mystics, and he said, in that experience, you behold what you are. You behold what you are. You are this infinite being. But then he says, and you are what you behold.
mm,
So it's like, oh my God. It's like the truth, the highest truth is revealed to you, and you behold that. Then you realize that that's what you are. But then you also realize you are what you're beholding. And it's like, that is that supreme infinite intimacy with divinity.
Will, beautifully, beautifully laid out there, that ecstatic moment of insight. You know, the story of Rumi, one morning in Konya, walking out and the blacksmith's beating his hammer on his anvil, and it creates a kind of a beat. And in that moment, Rumi just starts twirling in divine ecstasy of this realization of worship and also identification with the beloved. That is exquisite, and you see that show up in throughout all the different traditions. I want to say the Goy Peace Foundation have done beautiful work on this idea of an indwelling spirit, or the inner fragments, and that inner spark of God. In the Fuji Declaration, which they had a gathering at their Fuji sanctuary, people like Irvin Laszlo and others. But this idea of the indwelling spirit of God is also universal throughout all the different traditions. So that allows us to have that self-identification. Let me finish with the last question, Roland. This is one bringing together science, spirituality, all the different traditions, Eastern, Western, Middle Eastern, indigenous. Um, but this idea of creator and creation. And I understand you're very well versed in non-dual Advaita, Vedanta, thinking of all of the oneness of all things, or the non-dualness of all things. But how would you speak to the distinction ultimately, philosophically, theologically, spiritually, between creator and creation? Is there a distinction of any sort to be expressed between the creator and creation?
That's beautiful, beautiful question. Um, at some level, it's a supreme mystery that the created human being finds out that their deepest identity is oneness with the creator. And what the most advanced mystics report, who have had this full realization, is that sometimes they have experience of God consulting them about kind of what's next. What steps shall I take as God? And since you are my beloved with whom I am so united and we are one, I'm asking you. In that case, God actually consults the creature to kind of unfold the next level of creation. I find that so striking, and you read this in some of the mystics, and even in um, Krishna takes Arjuna after Arjuna's full realization in the Mahabharata, takes him to meet Purushottama, which is the supreme Godhead, the absolute Godhead, and basically he's bringing him to the point where you and God are going to collaborate directly. And so, at one sense, there isn't a distinction. I'll give you another way in which there's not a distinction. One of the beautiful hadiths from Islam is where this is God's a hadith is basically the word of God that Muhammad heard. But it's very similar to what they call, in Hinduism, they have the actual revealed scriptures, and then they have the Shruti. And so you have this idea that the divine is directly witnessed. And in this particular hadith, God says, I was a hidden treasure and longed to be loved. It's translated in different ways. Sometimes it's longed to be loved. Other times it's longed to be known. But the essence of it is, I was a hidden treasure and longed to be known or loved. And so I created the cosmos. So that God, as God, and only as God, is this unmanifest, infinite, supreme essence being that is there. How it got there, I don't know, but there it is. And it was such a hidden treasure that it longed to be known. It longed to be appreciated. And somehow, so God had to create in order for that hidden treasure to be revealed, even to God, in a sense. And in the interpretation of the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, particularly from Daniel Matt. I don't know if you know of him, but he's a remarkable scholar of the Zohar, which is one of the documents that articulates, I think it was in Spain around 12th, 13th century, that basically articulates the Kabbalah. But anyway, in that, he says, God affirms that God needs humanity to be fully God. It's clear to us that humanity needs God to be fully human, right? That we need that divine aspect of our humanity in order to grow into the fullness of who we are. But God needs humanity to be fully God. And this is similar to, I was a hidden treasure I had to create in order to be loved and to be known. So there's something about that creator entering into the process of create. God could have just not created, but the very process of creating was in order to have it come full circle so that God can only realize the fullness of God through creation. In some sense, there's truth to that. And so I'm not an expert and I'm not, but my sense is that there is, of course, a distinction at the kind of levels of gradation, because as I understand creation, it comes then through levels. It's emanations into essentially the archetypal and heavenly realms, and then further emanations into this realm. And I have a whole little thing on E equals MC squared in a vertical form that goes from the essence of God, the first divided by light and gives you the heavens, and second division by light gives you manifestation. And therefore E equals MC squared is really a deeper principle than just mass energy equivalence. It's divine essence and manifestation equivalence in the vertical direction.
Wow.
That's another matter. But bottom line is that the supreme, whatever it is, descends into manifestation, but immediately there's this upward yearning that goes back into, and you have, as Aurobindo talked about so beautifully, spirituality evolving into matter and matter evolving into spirit. And there's this communion. And ultimately, is there a separation? No. But are there different levels? Yes. We see different identifiable ontological levels, but in truth, it's not separate at all. And the prayer, the supreme prayer, that according to the theosophist, Dwal Kul, I don't know if you know that whole body of work, but he says the future of religion will be nothing other than the human being with the depths of the heart invoking the supreme, and the supreme being responding by evoking its blessing and grace. So it's this vertical, energetic, constant communion from creature to the supreme. And that is replicated in miniature in the human body between the head and the genitals. And that whole cycle in the body that happens up the esoteric channels in along the spine. They call the Sushumna in the Hindu tradition, or the central channel in Tibetan Buddhism or in Taoism. But basically, the human being is literally a microcosm of the cosmic process. And so those creative forces are integral to the manifestation in a very significant way. And they're kind of keeping it going and sustaining it. the whole time, both in the esoteric essence of the human being and the cosmic process between creator and creature.
Amen. Amen. Hallelujah. Om Shanti and Mashallah. This is magnificent. Well, this is good news. I think that we all need to hear and to listen and to dive into even more fully this universal call to relationship, guided and inspired but a personal experience, but also with all these human histories, so many resources to offer us, and conditioned by advancements in science as well, as we go hand in hand together further and deeper into truth individually, personally, but also collectively. Our institutions have got to evolve, all of them, academic institutions, religious institutions, there's so many others will be affected by this profound insight. What has been a secret of the mystics and the sages, now it really truly needs to be heard and understood by the planet as a whole, which will be the ultimate act of grace, saving grace for all of us. So I want to thank you.
It is the birthright of every human being to discover it too. You're absolutely right. This is the saving grace. Can I give one more little scientific piece?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Please.
There's I think really a major breakthrough that occurred in about 1980 with the discovery of fractal geometry in mathematics. And it led to the whole understanding of the holographic nature of reality, where we have, for example, if you take a Romanesque broccoli, have you ever looked at one of those Romanesque broccolis? And the little nodule on the side of the broccoli is a miniature of the whole.
Oh, sure.
Then if you look at the nodule, it's got identical little miniature nodules on it. Or if you look at certain types of evergreen trees, if you take off the little tiny branch and you turn it upside down, it's a miniature tree.
Mm.
It's like, so there's a way in which the larger cosmic process replicates itself in its entirety in a smaller creature. And this is mathematically revealed in the whole process of fractals and mathematics, which for me was a major awakening, but also in science. And it actually gives a mathematical structure for how mysticism works.
Mm-hmm.
Because it shows that if you take the little subset of a fractal is a perfect replica of the entirety, even though it's sometimes millions of times smaller. But it itself contains the full infinity of that structure within its finite boundaries. And that is a profound metaphor. The human being, although a finite, bounded creature, contains the full infinity of divinity within each one of us. And this is the great, as you said, the great revelation that if we can help more people to have this experience and to be able to live from that place, we will live in a profoundly different world and a profoundly healed world. And that is urgently needed at this time. Yeah.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen. Hariom. Will, thank you. Thank you for your everything, your mastery, your wisdom. It's definitely medicine for our times. And I would like to thank you for taking the time and a busy schedule to sit down with me for this discussion, which part of it will go into what becomes some written work, but also we hope people will enjoy watching this dialogue as a video as well. So deep gratitude to you.
And thank you so much. Thank you for your good work. And I'm excited about this anthology. I also have a chapter in it on a vision of the future of interspirituality, which is how the religions can work together. So, but blessings on finishing this work, and really good to talk with you. And I really appreciate your questions. They're really probing and trying to get into the essence of the depth of what spirituality is all really about. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, you've really inspired me with this. If people haven't got this yet, get on, Amazon or wherever and go and get yourself a copy. It's extraordinary. Will Keepin, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it so much.